All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kiro bi-weekly show. My name is Brian Beach. I've been a guest on this show a few times, but this is my first time hosting. So typically, you're probably used to seeing maybe Darko or Eric or even Brooke here as a host. I've done a few of these shows now as a guest, along with one of them hosting, but this is the first time that I'm hosting it myself. So most of the team is out and distracted with SF Tech Week out in San Francisco. So there's a lot of events going on this week, and so I am filling in as the lead. And for those who haven't seen one of these before, I work at AWS and I lead a community of developers within AWS based out of North Carolina. And I've got a couple of guests here today to help me talk a little bit about how to customize the spec-driven development process. So in prior shows, we have talked about spec-driven development and all the benefits that come with spec-driven development. We've also spent some time in a show 2 or 3 episodes ago diving into steering files and how we can help use that to customize the experience in Kiro. But we talked about those independently. And what I want to do today with a couple of guests is bring those two things together and talk about how we can use steering to customize the spec-driven development process. So if you've ever wanted to do something like maybe change the format of the user stories or add a few extra diagrams that are common for your organization, that's what we're going to focus on today and how to achieve that. But we'll start with some introductions. We'll talk about some of the new features and things that have happened in the product recently, and then we'll jump into the main focus of customizing spec-driven development. So with that, I have 2 guests. I'm going to first pull in Kevon. And Kevon, if you want to do a quick introduction for everyone.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Kevon Mayers. I'm a solutions architect at AWS, primarily working with video game studios. I'm also the infrastructure as code focus area lead. So I deal with a lot of customer stories with infrastructure, specifically more recently getting into things like agentic AI. Was one of the contributors to the Cloud Control API MCP server, and I'm based in Florida. Great to
Excellent.
be here.
Great. Thank you. And then second guest, quick, that I'm going to pull in, I've been working with for a while now, for many years that I've been here. I'll pull in Will Matos.
Hey, thanks for having me. Will Matos. I'm a principal specialist solutions architect with the next generation developer experience team. All that means is that I work with the service teams on integrating generative AI into the software development IDEs and process. I've been doing this and working with software development and AI for some time now. As Brian, as you mentioned, we've been working together for about 10 years now here at AWS, but been developing software for over 25 years. So this is a topic that's quite close to my heart, if you will. I've been here in North Carolina for a bit of time as well. And so looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I think I was still up in New York when we first started talking, and then I came to my senses and relocated down to North Carolina as well. So we're only a few hours apart now, or maybe not even.
Exactly.
So yeah, excellent. So all East Coast still. I think everybody on the West Coast right now is probably pulled into the SF Tech events and all the excitement happening out in San Francisco this week. So you've got the East Coast contingent running the show this time. But welcome and thanks for taking time to spend some time with us. So I think everybody knows the topic of and the focus of today's show is going to be all about customizing the spec-driven development process. But before we head down and really dive deep into that, I do want to spend a moment and talk a little bit about some of the new things that have happened. There's always a lot of excitement and always a ton of announcements happening. It's hard to keep up with all of it. So let's maybe jump in. There's been quite a few things that have happened in the last 2 weeks since our last episode. I'll start. Kevon, what's exciting? What's got your attention from all the new launches? What are you excited about?
Yeah, there's really 3 main ones that are most interesting to me. The first one is, Sonnet 4.5 is now available in Kiro. That's going to be either directly in the chatbot, or if you're using Auto, that's also one of the foundation models that's available. Some great performances in terms of, benchmarks and things like that. But even anecdotally, using 4.0 and how that can be a little bit too agreeable. I don't want to fight with my AI agent, but I also don't want it to think that I'm perfect for everything and kind of lead me down, a bad path. So I've
Are
been
you
hearing.
suggesting that Sonnet has at one point or another told you you're awesome and you're a genius?
Yeah, I mean, more times than I'd like to admit.
Yeah.
So, with 4.5, I've been hearing it'll push back a little bit more, ask some clarifying questions. And honestly, that's what I'm looking for, right? I want a companion. I want someone that's going to challenge me, but not fight with me. So, hopefully this is, good happy medium.
Excellent.
Beyond that, the diagnostic tools
Yeah.
in Kiro, also something that I'm looking for. Really an automatic way, anything that your IDE would, output in terms of errors, syntax, things like that, automatically being able to resolve those instead of having to say, hey, at the end of whatever you
Yeah.
do, make sure you fix all
Mhm.
these linting issues and things like that. And finally, maybe honestly might be my favorite one is the automatic git commit
Yeah.
messages. This is a huge thing for me as I'm going through and making commits. Because I like to move fast, I don't really worry about my commit messages until I finally submit the PR, and then I got to do an interactive rebase and make it not look like a bunch of foolishness.
Yeah.
So this seems like it'll save me a
Yeah.
lot of time.
Not
Yeah.
me. I never do that. I'm always very thorough in all of the comments I write, and they definitely don't just focus on the last thing I did and ignore
Yeah.
the prior
I,
4 or 5 hours.
I've seen your commits, Brian. So,
I'm sorry. I apologize.
but I think that's definitely something that's pretty cool. For a while now, I've been controlling a lot of that using steering files and prompts and automating it that way. But that's not as
Yeah.
reliable as having it built into a Kiro. So
Yeah.
that's definitely a welcome feature.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious. I'm going to throw this out to the chat and ask a little bit about their experiences with 4 or 5 so far and what they're feeling. I see a couple questions coming in, really just focused on very basically what's the difference between 4 and 4 or 5. So I'll throw a few of those out there and we can chat about them a little bit. But I think, right, of course, 4 to 4 or 5 is a significant improvement. We're seeing really good improvements in benchmarks like SWE bench, right? 4.5 is now the top ranked on SWE bench and pulling better than 80% accuracy numbers. I haven't personally, to be honest, had a lot of time yet to play in 4 or 5. I've been really busy the last week and it's only been out for about a week. So I don't have a lot of depth there, but I am seeing a lot of reports about it being significantly faster. And also, as I think Kevon was mentioning at the beginning, a little less sycophantic and spending a little less time telling me how awesome I am and a little, being maybe a little bit more realistic, which is true, of course, across all of these large language models. Many of them have that behavior. So have you had a chance to play with it yet? Have you had seen any significant differences?
You're asking the crowd, or?
Well, I'd love to hear everyone's input. I'd like to hear yours as well, though, if you've had a chance to really dive in.
Yeah. I have been using it quite a bit lately. I think it does a pretty good job at a lot of the more complex reasoning. When I give it some pretty complex prompts, I tend to engineer some prompts that are longer and more detailed than most. And seeing it not struggle as much with those prompts as I've seen some of the other versions is a pleasant experience. There's some things where it may get a little carried away sometimes, over engineering some things, but when instructed appropriately, it does a pretty good job.
Excellent, good. Yeah, and that's part of why I pulled you into this. I know you're usually pushing the boundaries of what these tools can do, and really pushing the boundaries on the prompt and context engineering side of all of this. So glad to have you.
I'm just trying to break it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly, that one of the other features that they dropped as well was the MVP feature, spec MVP task, and that's something that I've been trying to also engineer through prompts and some contextual prompting as well. But the MVP task is pretty neat because it allows you to generate the task where it focuses on the main functionality of the application or the feature that you're adding, as opposed to all of the additional unit testing and additional documentation or other tasks that might take quite a bit more time. I've seen some instances where I have a very simple task, but because of all of the additional requirements around testing and documentation, that simple task takes quite a bit of iteration on the task execution to get it done. And sometimes I just want to be able to demo it very quickly. And so being able to skip those is quite useful.
Yeah. And I think, of course, the other side effect of that too is the impact on your context window, right?
Yes.
And it's not just that it's running this extra step. It's often dumping the entire log set back, and your unit tests, your linters, some of those things that you might want to be specific about when you want to pull them in. When do I want to? When do I not want to run that? I don't necessarily want it to always run that and bloat the context as a result. Yeah. So these are great strategies we're starting to see to help manage the context window size and be able to selectively decide when I do and don't want to incorporate something. So
indeed.
Yeah, great. So I think the other one, Kevon, that you mentioned a little bit was this idea of diagnostic tools. And I don't know if that's maybe immediately obvious what that is to everybody. Mm-hmm. You mind spending a moment and talking a little bit about what it's doing?
Yeah, pretty much. So, as you're going through and writing code, right, there's a number of different extensions that you might have. I write a lot of Terraform code, so I have the HashiCorp Terraform, extension added, and, syntax errors, things like that you'll kind of go through, especially as Kiro is building out. I've been using it a ton for massive refactoring of Terraform modules. Like, hey, I've built this module. This is now the gold standard. Refactor these other modules to fit the general architectural design principles, the way that I'm kind of structuring the module. And then usually what I'll have to have through is kind of customize a steering doc and say, oh, and by the way, if you encounter any errors, then as the last step, go ahead and resolve that. But with this new diagnostic tool, this is going to be doing it as it's going through writing and making changes to the code. So it's something that also it'll help cut down the errors, it'll help really speed up the time to actually get something from initial code or refactoring to actually something that can be deployed.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we tend to sort of fault these large language models for hallucinating. I hear people talk about hallucinations all the time, and if you step back and think about it, I hallucinate a lot more than these models do. But as I'm writing code, I make a lot of dumb mistakes and forget the names of methods and stuff like that. And the IDE is just helping me out as I go, right? It's underlining things, it's putting in the issues list. And I'm reacting to that in real time, so I don't feel the pain of my own hallucinations. We've spent, and Will, I know you're working on this, but we spent a lot of time doing things like taking the steering files and trying to force Kiro to run linters after it generates code. Essentially, we're just building that right into the tool now, right? So it's looking at the same feedback coming out of the extensions that are plugged into the IDE and doing that in real time, so I don't have to go and do things like manually tell it through steering to go and run linters after the fact, which is awesome.
Yeah, I've been doing that for some time already, and I think where I've settled was adding a separate process, kind of a quality gate at the end of these commit processes, where I have it run through all those additional checks and then fixing those checks. The problem is those fixes become kind of a separate topic in that chain of commits, and it takes you away from the actual focus of the changes you were making. So being able to fix those as you're working on the capability that you're adding and addressing those linting issues in line, if you will, just keeps it much more organized and a bit more strategic in how you tackle it.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Cool. So yes, just before we move on, I do see in the chat there's a couple of comments. Mohammed's calling out and asking a little bit about the auto feature. So we talked a bit about the addition of Sonnet 4 or 5. The other thing that I just want to call out is there is now the auto feature that will move between the available models automatically and make decisions in real time about what's the best model to use for this purpose. And of course, as the model list expands, that will start to move across additional models over time. So that came along with it. And I think we forgot to mention it here. With that, let's change it. I'm sure there's a lot of other new things that we're forgetting to mention. It's hard to keep up with all of it, but let's change gears. I want to switch into the focus of this, which is all about customization and customizing spec-driven development. Before we do that, though, I just want to spend a moment and kind of recap what we've done in prior sessions. So in some of our prior discussions here, we've had very similar conversations about pieces of this. So a couple of episodes back, I did a live stream and built in real time a Hangman game. Very simple workload, but just went through the paces of building out a Hangman game using spec-driven development. And so I've got that project up. And just to recap quickly, so everybody who didn't see it gets a sense of where we're starting from. Here, what I've got is I've got the high-level description, and I've done this in spec mode. So I've gone through building a specification for the Hangman game before we started writing code. I think the benefit of this is really obvious, but I'll state it anyway. In vibe coding, we tend to be making a lot of corrective actions after we've started writing code, which means that we're constantly rewriting the code base. These tools can generate code at an amazing pace, right? Kiro is generating more code in an hour than I could write in a day. It's probably writing more code in a couple of minutes than I could write in a day. But if we're constantly making those iterative changes, we're also accumulating technical debt. So building a spec up front, going through and working out all of that uncertainty before we start writing code really cuts down on the amount of rework we need to do, and as a result, cuts down on the technical debt that we're accumulating in that process. And so just to recap, when I build a spec, I go through this 3-step process of creating requirements, which are generally set up as a series of user stories, right? As a player for Hangman, I want to input letter guesses in the keyboard to make guesses within the game. And from that, we move into a design. Here, I'll do this in preview mode, right? And I start to move into a technical design where I put together my component diagram and get down into not writing code yet, but starting to define what is that interface going to look like? What is my public, what am I exposing publicly before I write code so that we can agree on it? I can look it over and say, hey, does this make sense for me? All right, and it does a pretty thorough job of this. And then finally takes that and breaks it down into a task list, breaks this down into a bunch of little mini sprints. Each of these is going to take just a couple of minutes to implement, not 2 weeks, but breaks this down into work. And that gives me some really clean checkpoints to review my code after each one. So we spent some time on this a couple episodes ago. And then we also talked a bit about steering. And steering is really used for a lot of purposes. This is additional context that helps drive the implementation. And so here, had I not had this, it would offer to create steering documents. And generally what we do is create a little product description. What is this thing, right? It's a Hangman game. We go through the tech that's involved, what technologies are here. This was a Pygame implementation. And then basic instructions for how to build the game. And finally, the structure. What does the folder structure look like? And all of these are used by Kiro when I come back in and I want to make changes. So if I want to add a new feature into the game, this is a great starting point, a great foundation for it to build on so that it doesn't have to go and interrogate the application over and over again, trying to figure out what's happening. In addition, in that same episode, we talked a little bit about using this to drive things like coding standards. So for example, this is my Python implementation, and I do things like saying, I want to have doc strings, right? Doc strings in my methods, and I want to always use type hints as part of my Python code. So we use steering as a way to control the code that Kiro is writing, or at least that's what we focused on last time. What I want to do in this episode is bring these two concepts together and talk a little bit about how we can use the steering files, not just to drive the code, but to actually change the behavior of that spec-driven development process and customize it a little bit along the way. I'll pause there, and if you've got comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd also love to hear a little bit about how everybody out in the chat is using the steering capabilities as well as their experiences with steering. And then I'll do a quick little introduction.
Yep.
So,
I mean, from my side, steering has been really instrumental to, like I said, I've been doing a ton of refactoring right now. And to your point, it makes it a lot more efficient to hash all that stuff out, right? One of the challenges for one of these projects I was working on is there wasn't really a defined set of standards that were set for some of these Terraform modules that we were distributing. So each module kind of had a different way that it was doing things. So being able to kind of hash out, all right, what should we be doing, and kind of turning that into these standards, right? Module best practices, and then using steering to say, hey, go ahead and do this refactor and ensure that each is aligning to these, that really helps speed up the time for me. So I love steering, and definitely this whole spec-driven flow.
I think you're really hitting on a key point of it too, which is, as the velocity increases, right? Kiro's making it so much easier, so much faster. It's really hard. It becomes even harder to keep everybody aligned on what good looks like when everyone's working at this just super accelerated pace.
Yeah. And steering, I think, has been a huge part of what I do in the projects that I've been working on. I use these steering files to define everything from the patterns that I'm looking for within the application that Kiro needs to be aware of, defining even workflows, as you mentioned before, some of what we call the AI DLC, the AI-driven software development lifecycle, where we're trying to change the way you think about integrating AI in the software development lifecycle, where AI is driving a lot of the process, driving the generation of a lot of the content, but you're still part of that human in the loop, providing you're essentially the gate, if you will, approving every step, understanding exactly what it's doing, instead of vibe coding and letting it do whatever it wants and then not knowing what it did at the end of it. And so steering allows me to define those workflows, define those steps, define those checks along the way to improve the quality of what I'm creating.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. I'm going to throw up just a quick, there's a comment in the chat about using this for hackathons and having a really good experience. And I think this is a great lead in to this quick demo that I'm going to do. So I was running a hackathon fairly recently, and I'll show you first the before, what this experience looks like. I'm going to go through the process of this. One of the examples that I watched someone do in a hackathon. And some of their comments were, hey, I wish that some of the steps in the spec-driven development process were a little different. They don't match my style. And so we had a conversation in real time about, hey, how can I change that? How can I use steering to drive this process to incorporate some of my best practices? And that was kind of the catalyst for this session. So imagine here, the original prompt here was about, I've got a bunch of devices out in the field. Imagine this is like an electric utility. And they have all these capabilities that we're not using. In this hackathon, what the participant wanted to do was gather back temperature, humidity, pressure data, and then use that to drive weather predictions. And they were building this, this is just a short-term one-day hackathon experience, but they wanted to put together this prototype that went and took all this data in and tried to use it to improve their weather predictions, which in turn would, of course, help drive their forecasting for how much power they were going to need. And so I'll show you first. This is before. This is if I ran this as is. And so the requirements document comes back, and it has a whole series of user stories in it. And in those user stories, there's a series of personas, maybe my production manager, and there's a few others. And one of the comments that I heard was, hey, we always have a personas doc that lists out all the individual personas and who they are. And we agree on that before we start writing user stories. I'd like to see that reflected in it. When I come over to the design, just like you saw before, there's this nice architecture diagram. But a lot of what we're building here was very focused on data. And so there's a lot of detail in here about the data model. But the feedback I got was, hey, it would be really cool if we had an ER diagram in there, not just a component diagram. And again, I can just influence that by using steering, right? And then the last one that I didn't hear necessarily in this hackathon, but I've heard so many times before is, hey, I love this idea of building a task list, but I wish that Kiro would put this together in a way that always had a demoable MVP at the end of each one of the task sets, because we always do a little bit of a show and tell at the end of each sprint. And I would like to be able to touch the app. And sometimes the early tasks aren't set up in a way where the application is yet usable, and you've got to get through 3 or 4 tasks before you can actually touch it and feel it and see if it's good. So what we did in that, and I'm going to keep this super simple, but I suggested that we set some steering up here. And I'm just going to add a new steering doc in for spec roles, let's say. Whoops, got to type that right. All right. And there's a lot that we covered in the prior sessions on setting up these steering docs, but I'm just going to set up 3 simple rules that say, hey, when I create a requirements document, always list the personas first. And when creating the design document, always include an ER diagram if there's a database schema. And then finally, the last one, I want to make sure that I'm in a functional state at the end of each of these. So I'll put that in. And now I'll come back through and just throw that same prompt in. I know I didn't show this to you before, but I'm in spec mode. And this prompt talks about our utility meters include temperature, humidity, pressure sensors that we're not using. I want to be able to collect that data and use it to do some forecasting. And so if we give that a minute, I'll let it go and build the requirements document. And hopefully if it's using the steering, it will then incorporate those personas right at the top, which it didn't do in the prior one. And yeah, there it is. Right. So,
and it looks like it included it up there at the top, right? Spec rules, including steering documents.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So you see what Kiro's doing, right? It pulled this in because this is a steering doc. Those documents get added into the context automatically. And so that got pulled in, and then that was used to influence what it was doing in this step. And now you can see right at the top, it integrated that list of personas before we even got started. So we think of these often, right? And we tend, and we're at fault here, right? When we do these shows, tend to talk about each of these features in isolation, but you can really layer them on top of each other to get you the results you want. So you can start to really manipulate the tool and control not just the output, but the actual flow that's happening during it. I'll jump ahead really quickly because I have an after one of these, and I don't want to spend all of our time just on this silly example. I know Will's got much more advanced examples to show us than I've done. But as I continue through this, right, I had my, sorry, let me close this one. Right, I've got in my requirements, again, my personas were called out at the beginning. Then when I went into the design, you can see here that I've got, again, my architecture diagram. But because I told it that I want an ER diagram, it's now gone and drawn that into it. And I don't have to just do this, right? I could do sequence diagrams or any other diagrams that I want to incorporate in. And finally, the last thing that, if you remember, I told it to do was that I wanted to structure my tasks in a way that I always have a demoable MVP at the end. And you can see that it's done that. And not only that, but it's also suggested at the end of each one, here's a good demo to do. When you go to your showcase meeting, which you probably won't do anymore because each of these only takes 2 or 3 minutes, and you're not going to have a showcase meeting every few minutes. But conceptually, I've done this in a way that there is something to demo, and here's my suggestions for what to demo. So I've really been able to take and use steering to control that flow of what I expect to see in each of these documents. And you could use that to build your organizational standards into it and make these docs look a lot more like what this would look like if the people on your team were doing it.
Now, you said that it's done that. So in here in the tasks, it added specific tasks or sections where it makes...
It's not actually adding a new task into the mix. Mm-hmm. So first, it is starting to incorporate these or order these in a way that will result in a demo.
Gotcha.
And like if you compare this to the prior one, the first step in that was really just setting up the folder structure. And then it would build out a few libraries, and I could run some unit tests, but there was nothing to show at that phase. Where now when I run this, it's putting it together into a way where at least I've got some data coming into the database. I've got stuff that I can start to show beyond just some classes that were generated. And this didn't exist before.
Yeah.
Right.
So where it might have
gets thrown in. Yep.
Exactly. So where it might have added a separate task to pre-populate data or a separate task to handle the UI, it's reorganizing it in a way that allows you to demo each of these each of these stages. Yeah, nice.
And it's hard. These tools, Kiro is able to generate so much code so fast that it becomes almost impossible to realistically review every line of code. And so it's really beneficial if at the end of these I can do a little showcase. I can actually touch the app that we're building and say, yeah, this is in line with my expectations. And it's also good that while we're writing unit tests in each of these phases, which Kiro already, I don't have to tell Kiro to do that. It always writes unit tests in each of the phases. I tend these days to just look at the unit tests and say, hey, are these in line with what I'm expecting? it's a lot easier for me to understand the functionality that's being built by looking at the unit tests and trusting that if the code coverage is high and I like the unit tests, that probably the code's okay. And I don't have to go and look at every single line of code. I'm sure lots of people disagree with me on that statement, but I find it just, I can't review the hundreds of lines of code that it's generating every minute.
And not just that, I think historically in the past, before we had these added features, you can get to further phases in this whole process before you realize that something was not done correctly earlier in the phases of the tasks that were executed. So being able to test that and demo it early, I think is a good practice.
Yeah. And when you get to the end and then you have to rewind a lot to make fixes, it's a lot more painful. You want to catch this stuff as early as you can and make sure that you're aligned, that what you're thinking is what Kiro's thinking.
Exactly.
Yep.
Cool.
I think that's especially important too when kind of going back to my refactor, right? When you're working on a large code base and there's interdependencies and you're not really sure of, what change might have downstream impact, definitely amplifies that a lot more. I've personally ran into that.
Yeah. Cool. Will, I'm going to throw you up on stage.
All right.
Here, and I know you've got a lot more advanced examples that I'm looking at. Those were really trivial compared to some of the stuff that I've seen you're working on.
Yeah, I've got a few examples. I probably don't have all the super advanced things here, but I think we'll be able to touch on some of the ways that you can influence the generation of specs. Is this size okay? Look good.
Yeah, looks good to me.
Looks good to me.
Let me just go ahead. So what I have here is it's an actual task management app, and it's just something I use for demoing and adding the ability to add features and demo those as well. And what I want to go through is how can I modify or customize the process of generating the specs like you've been talking about, Brian, at different stages. And this could be something as simple as asking it to take a certain step before moving on to the next step in the spec-driven development process, or kind of changing how we format specs, how we format requirements documents, design documents, tasks, and so forth. So in this case, I tend to use a lot of robust prompts for almost everything I do. I know I'm the anti-pattern for a lot of developers. I know what typically makes a developer a good developer is that we're a little lazy, and that forces us to automate everything we do, because I don't want to type something long too many times. The moment I have to do it twice, I'm going to write a script to do it for me.
I think we automate because we can, and the rest of the world doesn't because they don't have the skills to do it.
I like the word efficient over lazy, so I feel better about myself. But yeah.
True. Yeah. Sometimes I'm a little too direct. In this case, what I want to do is just add due dates to my task, and I'm providing a little bit of information so that it has at least something to go on. Kiro wants to generate a requirements document out of the gate and try to fill in the gaps where it finds gaps. It's going to suggest best practice responses or design decisions along the way without asking me. So the more you give it in the prompt, the better that initial document is going to be. So in this case, I'm just going to kick this off, and I can't recall if I selected spec mode. Well, we'll find out here shortly. Yeah, so it looks like it's looking for a spec. It didn't find a spec, so it's going to start creating that. And this is going to go through that normal process like you did, where it generates that initial requirements document. It will ask me to review it and see if it's up to the spec that I want for the specific feature. And then it'll allow me to move on to design and tasks. In this case, it shouldn't be too complicated. I'm looking for about 5 or 6 requirements. Let me just bring this down here. And so you'll notice a couple of things in here. First, let me look at what it created here. It wants to be able to set an optional due date when creating a task. I need to be able to edit it. See the due dates displayed on task cards. Yep, that's all good. I don't really care too much about 4, 5, and 6 really. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these 4, 5, and 6. And then from here, I'm just going to tell it that I want to move on to design. Just let it go ahead and generate the design, the simpler design. In the process, you'll notice that in the requirements, it's just standard requirements for this basic feature. And also, one of the things that you'll notice is that it starts reading the project to figure out what it is it needs to add into the design doc, what's already there, what isn't there. One of the things I do, and I didn't see it in your project, Brian, but from the steering file perspective, when you open this up the first time, you get that button, generate steering docs, right? And so if you don't have anything in here, it's going to give you that button. When you click on that button, it generates this product, structure, and tech document. And what these are kind of a summary. It's almost like an index, a quick cheat sheet, if you will, for Kiro, where it just walks through your entire project, figures out what important information is there that I should know quickly without having to traverse the details of the project every single time. And it will generate this. And the nice thing is that as you work on tasks, as Kiro has to dig deeper into the project to figure some other details out consistently beyond what's here, sometimes you can tell it in the chat, can you go ahead and update the steering files to reflect this new information you found? And I love doing that in the chat. You can actually have Kiro modify these files for you, create these files for you. So that's what I did. I created the product, structure, and tech file. And then I created this kind of task implementation steering file that was the result of one of these phases where it was going through and it had to look at a lot of different files to figure out what the structure was, how did these objects interact with each other. And I said, well, go ahead and save that in a steering file so you don't have to do this again next time. And so it went ahead and did that for me. So now with those 4 steering files in place, it's able to generate the design document. And it only had to visit a few files. Notice that it just visited these 6 different files here, whereas before it likely would have visited quite a few more files in my project to get the information it needed. And now that we're there, if we look at the design document, it's fairly straightforward. This one doesn't have a diagram in it like yours. I don't know if you had some type of instruction that told it to add the diagram, but in my case, it doesn't have that. It has some data model example.
I typically see the component diagram at the top of my design. It's not always there, but usually it is. And it depends on the workload. I did explicitly tell it to add the R diagram. That was the second.
Gotcha.
That was something I added.
Cool. So then, in this case, it didn't create that for me. And if we go to generate the implementation plan, it's just going to generate a number of tasks associated with the information it gathered here. But it didn't ask me anything. It didn't ask me any clarifying questions to understand what it is I really wanted in this requirements. It just went ahead and created this for me. So maybe one of the things I wanted to do is every time I generate a spec, I wanted to ask questions. I don't want it to assume. I don't want it to make decisions on my behalf. I want to be in control. I want to say, yes, make this change. No, don't make this change. Yes, I want to use this technology. I want to avoid using this other technology. And while I can do that by looking through the requirements and changing it, it's better if it asks me ahead of time before it generates this document. And so here we have all the files it's generated. What I'm going to do
I, by the way, love this idea, right? So when I'm working with users who are new to the tool, first vibe coding, of course, they're going to give it 1 or 2 sentences and extrapolate this mess. With this, they have an opportunity, right? With spec-driven development, they have this opportunity to go and look at the assumptions because Kiro's taken that short description and elaborated into a whole requirements doc, but we're trusting them to do it. And for new users, they don't always do it, and they don't really thoroughly look it over. And so forcing it to ask questions like this really changes that behavior and, kind of it presents them with a list of questions, forces them to think through it rather than just assuming that they're actually going to do their job.
Yeah. And so what I did here was I have this prompt, and instead of creating the steering file here, which you can do as well, I tend to do it all through the prompt here, and I'm just asking it to create a steering file that I can use to control the specs creation process. And in this case, I'm asking it to make a certain number of changes here in the process. But one of the things I've asked it to do before is when generating the requirements document, I want you to ask me questions. And you'll see, let me go ahead and, this is a bit more robust. I did generate this using Kiro the last time. And what you'll notice in this document is this one here. You'll notice that in this step of the requirements phase, I'm indicating that I wanted to ask questions. So I wanted to ask detailed questions that are mandatory about the user experience, about technical integration, about security and compliance, and even business questions associated with the application and the feature that I'm asking it to build. And I'm telling you, you cannot assume anything. I want you to be very explicit about what you're doing and ask me if you don't know the answer to the question. So if there's anything that's unclear, I want you to stop and ask specific questions about this. And then there's some other mandatory test scenarios, which from a good perspective, we actually rolled out these changes that allow us to even be more robust in the testing. So a lot of this isn't really necessary. I probably want to go through and pull out.
It's really hard to keep up, isn't it? It's like,
yeah, it is.
You know, every time you're building these things and you're customizing it, and then the tool is just outpacing you.
And I have to almost every day when I go to do a demo, that morning, I need to go through what was released today, what changes were made. Do I need to adjust my demo? Many times I'll go through and say, by the way, you don't have to do this anymore. Kiro does it for you. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. And then I have some other components associated with the visual side. So I wanted to generate these mermaid diagrams. I want them to be these colorful diagrams when you do it. And then some information about how I wanted to format the task. So I've kind of thrown all of this into this file here. And I'm going to go ahead and add it in here under my steering files. Again, this was generated by the actual prompt itself, but I already had one nicely formatted that I'll go ahead and include here. And so how does this impact what we're doing with the generation of these? So if I go ahead and just delete all this and let me ask it to.
Yeah, and I really like that clarifying question aspect that you mentioned, right? I feel like, especially as you start to work with in larger organizations, people start to operate in silos. So a lot of these clarifying questions, sometimes an end developer, especially a new developer, are just like, all right, well, this is the way that it has to be done. I'm not sure why, right? So I think that can lead to deeper level discussions of, are we even building this thing the right way? Or are we building this, are the requirements right? Are we passed down something that actually makes sense? So.
Yeah, exactly. You know, what's interesting is I've run processes, certain types of workshops with customers where we try to walk them through this methodology, this process of really understanding what it is you're asking for, asking these questions. And surprisingly, many times they'll start with existing user requirements and requirement stocks that they've created and find that Kiro is asking them questions that they never thought to ask. And it's forcing them to answer that up front. I've seen arguments between teams where the product manager and the software engineer or the architect or the QA team cannot come to an agreement on how those answers should be provided. Now imagine having to deal with that further downstream in the process after the requirements has been generated, after the user stories, the units have been defined. It just makes it so much more difficult. And so what it does is it forces you to follow this process where it's going to ask you questions in this section here. And so if let me just switch here to this one here. What I'll show you here is something even more robust that will show you a little extra trick I threw in there.
While you're looking for that, I'll I'll hit a couple of the questions in chat. So there's a question about is this recorded? Are we going to be able to watch it again? Yeah, these are. So this will be out on Twitch, although Twitch tends to be fairly short-lived, and it'll also be out on YouTube. So if you just search for the Kiro Biweekly Show on YouTube, you should be able to find this and the prior ones as well.
Yeah, so if we come back here, and so what I have here now is a document here where I've broken down some additional requirements in spec mode complete config. So that's the file that I originally added. And this is where all of those requirements were added. But then I also added a reference to this other file. And so Acme Corp development standards. I say, in addition to that modification, I want you to also keep track of these development standards that I want you to pay attention to and pull that in. And I want to know when you're actually loading these up. So I added a little trick in there that forces it to tell me that company standards were loaded. And here in the spec mode as well, it'll tell us that it has been loaded towards the end. And the end result, if we go back and redo this spec and just have it generate it here. I'll tell you, this monitor setup that has me turning my head so much. Like I think I'm going to end up needing
Occasionally I get to see
chiropractic adjustments here. Okay, so there's a task. I'm here. Let's close this down so it doesn't pull that into the context automatically.
So
let's see what happens.
While that's rolling, I'll share. I was working on recently this Kiro challenge. I don't know what it's going to be named yet, but when we get up to reInvent, we're going to run a little coding challenge as part of that experience. And I was doing this Q&A type session with Kiro for that. And I had all this stuff in my requirements and thought through all of the developer side of this, and somehow completely overlooked the whole spectator side, right? That we need a scoreboard up, and this is going to be in the expo center at a big event with tens of thousands of people there. And like the first question that it spit back to me was, hey, are there any other personas we should be considering, like a spectator? And you know, like as long as you think so long and so hard about this, you think you've got everything right, and you just miss big major pieces of it. And doing this Q&A thing changes it, and really you can do a lot of good brainstorming with Kiro, not just software development.
Yeah, absolutely. Notice what it did this time now. So I went through. It's telling me it loaded it. So it's a little, sometimes I need a little visual confirmation that, did you actually load that? Are you actually following the instructions? And so it says, custom spec mode guidance loaded. So I know that it loaded the custom spec guidance. And then it says company standards loaded. So it's also giving me feedback that it loaded the company standards. Even though I do see them here, this tells me that it's actually following the instructions in those files. That's where that's indicated. And then notice that it immediately stops. I haven't, if you look at the Kiro folder, there's no spec defined yet for this. We see here that there's nothing there because it hasn't generated that requirements document yet. It's looking for me to answer these questions before it generates the document. And so this is a great point for you to stop and really think through these items that it identified. Of course, this is a demo, so I'm going to ask it, don't do this, but I'm going to ask it to answer the questions for me. And I also want to track the answers. I'm telling it to track it in this answers file in the spec, but because the spec wasn't generated yet, I don't know what the name of the spec is going to be, and I didn't create it through the normal spec process. So I'm just telling it to figure it out. They tend to be pretty smart at figuring this stuff out and executing it. And so now,
so we just spent 49 minutes telling everyone that they really need to make sure that they we really need to embrace this. We really need to use specs, and we really need to get deep and make sure we're reviewing it all. And then you just said, ignore me and guess.
Right. I could always go through all 20 questions and answer them with you. But notice that it went through, it generated the spec here. It's got the requirements that it's generating. But here are the answers to all the questions that it asks. Now, of course, I can come in here and modify these answers and tweak them further and tell it to kind of figure it out again. But with that, it's going to ask me to look at that requirements document. And now we have the requirements document with all the details, the test scenarios defined. And all of this is part of what I defined in that special config. So these additional sections weren't there before, but now they're there as a result of that. I'm telling you that it's good to move to the design phase. So it's going to go back through. And now in the design phase, I'm expecting it to add some diagrams to my design doc as a result of some of the guidance I gave it in those files. And so
Awesome.
it'll go through that. But basically what we covered in terms of how to manage this is a couple things. One is that you can reference other files in your steering files. That's one thing that I think a lot of folks miss when looking at the spec for these steering files. You notice that there's a specific method to include these files. It's like this. But it's able to read those reference files. So you don't have to put them all in the steering directory. You can put them somewhere else so that they're not auto-loaded unless it meets the criteria defined in the actual steering file.
Don't bloat your context window unless there's reason, right?
Exactly.
Let it make a decision about when it needs to read those files. Don't just force it into the context over and over again.
Exactly. Like I like to keep my steering files pretty light, and then all of the detail I will put somewhere else and just give it the condition when to pull that document in to the context. And that'll help kind of reduce the amount of context that you're using.
Yep.
Well, I think it makes it a lot more readable too, right? You know, we want to make sure people understand what is it actually doing and why. And back to that refactor that I was doing, that was, you know, kind of one of the mechanisms I also use. Create this central design standards document that one will live in the Git repository that contributors can look at, but then also these, you know, different relevant or related files that can be a little bit more minimal, and it doesn't just turn into a black box of text that no one ever wants to read through besides Kiro. So
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so you probably notice the diagrams at the top. There's additional diagrams, the data flow architecture I told it to include as well. And so now this is doing exactly what I want it to do in the design phase. These are the types of design decisions that are and diagrams that are provided in our typical organization's design process. And so I wanted to make sure that it's included here. And now through that definition, it's automatically included.
Excellent. There's a question here from Mohammed, and I think what he's getting at is you're going into this Q&A, but what we'd also maybe like to see is don't ask me questions, but help me understand the different options and trade-offs, right? So I'm assuming I could also use steering to say, when you make an architecture decision, offer me a couple options, give me the trade-offs on why I might pick, you know, why would I want a NoSQL database versus SQL database in this case? And why are you suggesting one over the other? Don't just make that assumption blindly.
Correct. That is something that you can do. And actually, I have some examples where I let Kiro provide me with options. So it's like a suggest mode. So I tell it, I want you to work in suggest mode. I want you to generate the options, ask me the question, but generate the options and then describe the pros and cons of each option. But I still have to decide which of those to select. And I can make that happen at the requirements document phase. I can make that happen in the design document phase. But ultimately, as long as you instruct it how to approach that specific part of the spec generation process, it will follow that. And you can customize it to fit your needs.
yeah, and I think with Sonnet, you know, 4.5, it seems like that can also help in that process, right? Where when you kind of get these recommendations of different paths that you can go on, it doesn't just say, you know, oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's what we should do if it's clearly not the right path. So it seems like that combined with what you're talking about, Will, seems like it also can help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is just one example of the types of things that you can do with customization. But if you consider that pattern, generating prompts and steering files using Kiro itself, so kind of some meta prompting there, and then leveraging steering files and referencing more detailed steering files. And then finally, having Kiro kind of critique your steering files as well is a good practice. So you can give it the steering file and tell it, can you look at this file, make sure that it's optimally configured to allow you to interpret the instructions clearly. And it can help you identify some ambiguities in your steering docs as well.
Absolutely. Excellent. I know we're just about at a time on this. Will, I do want to call out one other thing that I've seen you do a few times, and I don't think we've acknowledged, which is often when you're doing things like updating these steering docs or even generating a prompt, you're first asking Kiro to do it for you, right? I've picked up this behavior too. When I want to update the steering doc, when I see Kiro make a mistake that I want it to then put into the steering doc so that it doesn't do it again, it just experienced this, right? It just lived this problem. And then I gave it corrective action. So it knew what it misunderstood. It knows what it's understood what I'm telling it. It is in a great position now to go and take that knowledge and push it into the steering doc. And I love that you're asking Kiro to do it and not trying to then go update it yourself and assume that you know more than the tool does, because you probably don't at this point.
Exactly. And it knows what it loaded in your steering file. It knows which instructions it followed. And so if it kind of veered off track or if it was lacking specifics in the moment, when you tell it to update the steering files, it will know what's missing and what it needs to add instead of guessing.
Excellent. So really quick recap as we wind down the clock now. I'll say we've talked in previous sessions, we talked a lot about spec-driven development and how that can improve your outcomes. In another prior session, we spent some time and talked a bit about steering documents and how you can use them to influence the code that Kiro is generating. Here, what we did was brought these two things together and talked about how we can take the steering docs and use that to influence the spec-driven development process so that we can start to change the behaviors, how those spec documents are written, what the requirements document looks like, what diagrams show up in the design doc. And then Will really took it to the next level and said, well, we can actually inject a Q&A session into this. We can start to discuss the trade-offs that we're making along the way in this process and really influence it and make Kiro do exactly what you want to do. So that's awesome. Yeah,
there's a lot you can do. Yes, absolutely.
There is. So with that, I want to just take a moment and say thank you. Thanks for joining, Kevon, Will. I really appreciate you spending an hour with me and telling everyone about the things you're doing with Kiro. So thank you.
Yeah, this was fun.
Thanks for having us on.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to wrap it here.
Thanks all.